Okay, so I'm here to talk about the storytelling and the importance of that in the analytics process. I'm going to apologize to 4 or 5 of you because you're about to go through an exercise that you've already done. I recognize a few familiar faces from when I've done this before. I have this exercise. There's 1,000 good reasons to do this exercise, so I find it to be a very useful way to get any of these kind of conversations started. And it's a little game, and it's called the ultimatum game. And so what we have here is some rules. I'm going to give you a second to read them. So I'll give you a little second to process, and then I'll read them out loud just to make sure we're all clear. And what you're going to do is you're going to pair up with somebody next to you. At the end of this, I'll tell you the backdrop to it. And it was actually a very broad, multinational study that was done by a research team of behavioral economists. And they have some really fascinating results. And for me, it really punctuates a lot of what we're trying to do in the analytics world. Okay, so you're going to pair up the next person next to you. Easy enough. You're going to have notionally $100 in the real experiment. They actually gave out $100 to every pair that did this, and they did this around the world. And it was money that actually mattered in some locations. Person A will offer a split. Doesn't matter who person A is, work it out amongst yourselves. If you can't work it out amongst yourselves, you already failed. Person B will either accept or reject this offer. So, person A says, hey, I'm going to give you $80. Person B will either say, yes, I'll take the 80, or I'll say, no, I don't like your 80. If person B accepts, both parties receive the allocation. If person B rejects, both parties receive 0. So person A has to offer something to B that's attractive enough for B to accept, for both people to end up with anything. But if you don't like the offer B, you are well within your rights to walk away with nothing as well. Okay, so pair up. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. This group is known for overthinking these kind of things. Just go with your heart.
I'll just observe you all. All right.
You got something. Who wants to offer the split? So if you offer the split, then you're in. Yeah, I'll accept it.
There's no negotiation, yeah.
Interesting to know if they sample this you just said,
One other comment, just so everyone's aware, you're only playing the game once. There's only one person A, only one person B. It's a one-shot deal.
There's only one offer, yeah.
you guys have had this game in your insights?
All right, we should have achieved the split at this point. Hopefully we've gone through that. It really doesn't matter if you have, but hopefully most of you got through it. Okay, this is where we get interesting. How many people offered $1 to person B? Thank you. You passed Econ 101. Very well done. What was it? Well, fair enough. Did you offer 1 cent? Yes. Even better. Okay. Was your deal accepted? No. Yes. All right. You, on the other hand, or your partner might, we need a little talking to. But and over here, was the $1 accepted over here? No. No. Well done. Thank you. All right. How many people offered something in the 10 to 20 range? All right. And how many people offered something greater than 50? 1, 2. Interesting. And were those offers accepted?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. You would think. Okay. Just as a quick show of hands, how many people were part of some transaction where the offer was accepted? Almost all of you. Okay, very interesting. Now for the punchlines. So they just play out in your group. So of course what the economists would say, offer the cent, offer the dollar. Why? Because $1 is better than no dollars. If your partner's being purely rational, as it were, they would accept the $1 because $1 is in fact better than 0. All right. I used to do this 2 rounds, don't worry about that. So what happened when this game was played worldwide? What was fascinating is that this thing was done with men, of course, versus women. Older people, middle-aged people, younger people. It was done in Fiji, it was done in South America, it was done in Europe. You name it, they sliced it and diced it. Most people won't be surprised that men on average offered the least. There's just a little more of that. It's a competition thing perhaps or something like that. But where it got really interesting is there was a whole set of communities where most of the offers were more than $50. And you start saying, well, you know, hey, maybe you just didn't understand, or no, I totally understood. And what the logic was, hey, look, I live in a small community. I live on an island in some cases. We're all in this together. And if I appear to be greedy, this thing's going to come back and haunt me, right? So I'm not interested in that. And so you got a lot, in certain cultures, you got a lot more, much more even splits. What was equally interesting is a lot of those north of 50 offers were rejected. And they were rejected because the other person would say, hey, look, if I take that, that person did me a favor. I owe him. I don't want to owe anybody anything, right? And so it's just fascinating, and you sort of get it in. This is a fairly simple problem, and we all sort of agree on what the rules, and there's not a lot of mystery around it. We don't have complex promotion things that we're worrying about or anything of that nature. This is a simple game, and yet it's very hard to predict what kind of decisions people are willing to make. And so if I had gone back to my agenda, which I blew right through, I have this question of how objective is your objective function, right? It's this notion that, hey, somehow we all have an inclination that we can articulate absolutely clearly what the objective function is for an organization. And what I've found through all the companies that I've had an opportunity to travel through, that is rarely the case. And there's always a more interesting story behind the people's objective functions than what, it just meets the eye. And that's a large part of what I want to talk about today. On my way to making this point, I've always been fascinated by the notion of the word optimal. And a lot of us have struggled, and I know there's a lot of people who, near and dear to me here that see the same issues. That, optimal sometimes is a dangerous concept. But what I really want to get is just some honesty around, are we optimizing or not? Right? And I have some notion of, hey, the solution approach, whether I solve it optimally or I have some sort of heuristic. And over here, some level of abstraction. And the reason that I put these two in here is because a lot of times, one of the biggest failure modes that I see in a lot of the modeling activities is people want the model to look as much like reality as possible. And in some cases, that's just an unmitigated train wreck. And it's important to understand that this is a level of abstraction. But once you get into that level of abstraction, I'd argue, and by the way, I'm going to say a bunch of things which I mostly believe in, but you're at a talk, you got to say something interesting, so bear with me. That this is in fact another form of creating a heuristic, right? If I solve an approximate problem exactly, that's a heuristic. If I solve an exact problem heuristically, that's a heuristic. And actually, there are very few problems out there where you solve the exact problem exactly. And once you realize that you're in this world of making an approximation and a heuristic, it liberates you a little bit. And in fact, I think it liberates you a lot. And what it allows you to do, and this is going to keep coming back to this theme, is to start focusing more on the story than exactly what the answer is. And over again, when I look at decision support situations or bigger decisions that companies have to make, again, the why is as important as the what. And if you take like a network design problem, sure you can load in 5,000 different parameters and values, and then you take small little changes and you get wildly different answers. It doesn't do anything for the decision maker to inspire any level of confidence in their ability to make that decision. What really does is to say, hey, when I pull these levers, these things become more attractive or these things become less attractive, and here's why. And then they can sort of retreat from that analysis and say, all right, I have some qualitative things that I have some things that are going to change over time, and I understand the mechanics of what's moving these and roughly how big of a lever I'm pulling when I do it. More often than not, I find the decision maker dramatically more comfortable with that than they are with, tell me exactly what the answer is. because life is full of all sorts of uncertainties and all sorts of messes. And I think it's very important to sort of get liberated from giving them exactly what the answer is versus being able to tell the story. And it's a great, you have two levers that you can pull to simplify your problem and focus on the why. How you solve it and how you model it. And I think those are two very important tools that need to be pulled. I'm always open for disagreement and stuff, so raise your hand midstream. I don't have a particular agenda or anything else today. Our beliefs about decision support. So I always reluctantly use the word belief because now it sounds like I have some sort of following or something, which I don't. I only expect about 15 people here, so I may reevaluate. But a big part about this is that visual interfaces are key. And this used to be more interesting 3 years ago when you looked at it, but technology certainly moved a lot. But I still find that it's very useful, despite a lot of people being more and more aware of this. They're still implementing more and more solutions that don't really measure up in terms of this visual and really intuitive interface. But there's actually more to that visual and intuitive interface as well. And one of my big sort of ahas as I went through all of this was not everybody thinks the same thing's intuitive, right? And so if you're in the decision support business, chances are we've all had a senior manager above us change. And when they change, they say, well, I don't get that. This is how I need to see this problem because this is how I think about it. And so how do I have a reporting layer or an interaction layer that allows me to move as either the business issues or the business climate or the decision maker changes, right? It's very important because what was intuitive for one rarely is intuitive for the next. I work in a number of cases with direct competitors, and I am fascinated by how dissimilarly they run their businesses. And it's because the decision makers need to see the story in a different way. And that's where it gets me with this next one, which is the interaction with the math is as important as the math itself. One of my favorite projects was, with a little bit of a backstory, at the end of the Cold War, there were all these nuclear physicists in the Soviet Union that needed something to do. And the CIA said, well, they can build bombs for somebody, or they can solve math problems for American corporations. So the CIA paired up a bunch of companies with these analytics teams in the Soviet Union, and they did some fabulous work. But there was 1 or 2 cases where they had a little more challenge. And one of those places was on the forecasting. They built the mother of all statistical forecast engines. I won't even pretend that I understood significant portions of what they did, and I spent a fair amount of time on this stuff. But the problem was, they would spit out an answer. The vice president would say, well, I just got off the phone with one of my biggest customers, and they want to do something. Do I move your number up or down? No idea, because we don't know how we got to the number. So they said, well, that's great. I like your number, but I can't use it. End of story. I can't interact with your model. I don't understand what it's doing. I don't know why it does what it does. So I literally am going to turn this thing off because these decisions are too big for me just to trust a number. And so, this interaction and the why and the levers that move it are as important as the quality of the output. There was a project that was summarily rejected from a company that, is hugely invested in analytics and is a huge believer of it. So it's not that this was, off the beaten path, hey, this is some new space age stuff. This was a company that, does a tremendous amount of work in the area of analytics. And that sort of gets me to this last piece then. The decision support is best developed in an iterative model. And it's really this iterative process is always focused on the why. So what happens when I've been doing this now for a lengthy period of time, I won't even pretend to get the right answer the first time I put something in front of somebody. I got to put something out, I got to watch what they're doing. And then you sort of say, well, I see you're constantly looking for this other piece of information. How can we get that in there? Oh, I see you're trying to use this information in this way. Well, let me tell you why you can't use it, but let's talk about what you're trying to do. Right? There's this iterative loop, and it sort of has to come back with, hey, you're interacting with the math, and we're trying to get to a bunch of these whys. And I think for if you're in a position where you're thinking about, hey, I can go buy a piece of software to solve a problem, I would highly, highly recommend, for 2 good reasons. If you can't get through this prototype process on your own, because you lack the analytical ability internally, I would caution you against buying the software, because I don't think your organization will understand the software well enough ever to get the full value out of it. So that's one good reason to do it. The second good reason is, as you go through this prototype process, you will learn more about your requirements than you ever would have listening to a bunch of vendors or having a high-level discussion of, you start getting overly locked into feature functionality. Hey, can I do allocations by market type? Hey, can I do segmentation this way? And it becomes this mechanical list rather than going through and someone actually trying to do the work and figuring out what they're trying to answer, and then putting some of that in front of the decision makers to see how they're going to interact with the output. So I think there's two fabulous reasons to go through this prototyping effort internally. I think you'll be a much more educated consumer, and you will more aptly buy the right product. So I sort of lump things into why versus what problems. And this is, again, where I hope to have probably offended at least one person in the room, but so be it. Whatever, it's one man's point of view. And rather than go through each of these, I want to just talk about themes. There is a set of problems out there, like carrier optimization. I haven't yet met the vice president of anything interesting who actually cares which carrier is used, right? Did it leave on time? Did it get there on time? And did it happen at right cost? If all that's happening, doesn't matter which carrier does, right? That's where the people making the decisions are empowered to go make those decisions, unless one's a golf buddy. That's the only time anyone cares. On the other side, there are other things where management is deeply involved and has something vested in the outcome. And they're not looking for a decision, they're looking for a decision aid, or a guardrail, or a guard band, or keep me out of trouble, or help me correct this, give me some feedback. And so the theme around these things are things that are very transaction, I need to do a lot of, and I need to do very quickly. These are going to be the what problems. The things that are more planning related, that require some qualitative and quantitative factors, that can't possibly be all-encompassing, these are more the why problems. And so when if you think about in your organization, which of these trajectories am I heading on, I think it's useful to think, hey, am I really in the business of why, or am I in the business of what? Because that's going to affect how you manage your data, it's going to affect the kind of solution that you create, it might affect the approach you take in terms of this more iterative approach versus, hey, maybe I don't need the iterative approach for my transportation optimization. Again, that's a more broadly well-defined, well-understood problem, and the solution providers there have done a fantastic job of really nailing that problem. So I think it is important to understand the difference between these whys and these whats. Okay, so part of what I'm going to do over the next couple slides, I'm going to start weaving in some more examples of things we've done, and sort of come back to this theme of either decision support versus decision making, and the whys versus the whats. So one of the things that we started working on, we call this the reality check tool. That's sort of what the first group that we engaged with is. We now have 7 or 8 or 10 or 12 companies using it. But honestly, this is not a sales pitch. I'm just telling you that this is a concept that has been broadly adopted by some interesting people, and that's really the sort of takeaway. And so what we have here is a tool that does a variety of analytics, but just take the name of it, the reality check tool. How management wanted to use this was to say, I get in all these forecasts from all these different groups in my organization. I get the sales forecast, I get it rolled up. I get the regional business manager's forecast, and I need to reconcile that with this. I have a financial plan of record. I need to reconcile with that. And the question is, I know I have oodles of bad forecasts in here, and I have thousands of these. How do I go figure out which ones are good and which ones are bad? Right? So this was a case very explicitly. I don't care. I'm not asking you for the best forecast. I'm asking for which ones I have good reason to believe are bad. And so there is a very visual interface. There's also some tables that you can rank and sort and do this. And we were surprised at the level of seniority at which people were willing to use this tool. Originally we thought it would be some of the analysts preparing stuff for their bosses to use it, but the bosses got quite comfortable using it, in part because they could quickly sort of rank things, pick up something that looked funny, and go see a picture. And they'd say, oh, yeah, we've been over forecasting this 6 cycles in a row. I can see what's going on. Yeah, this one stinks. Let's go talk to Jim and see if we can get some feedback on it. Amazingly enough, the thing that this did remarkably efficiently was find data error issues. So one of the first people we did was a bottled water company. And instead of someone put in, fat-fingered 4 million instead of 400,000. I can tell you 3.6 million extra bottles of water is not anything that a Safeway wants to receive, right? But again, it is the ability to process a lot of information, rank sort stuff on metrics that people cared over time, right? You tell a senior person, very senior person, you have a forecast bias problem. All right, whatever. You show them a picture of a forecast bias problem, and that problem gets solved pretty darn quickly. And again, this is that important of the visual interface, and this is an example where we never told them the what. We're sort of back into this business of, well, somewhere between what's wrong and perhaps why. this was one of my favorite projects ever. And this is one of these things, I could go on for 2 hours on this one, and I'd probably cry halfway through it and whatnot. It was both painful and very pleasant memories. But this aspect of it was particularly choice. And what was one of the most rewarding things about this, as a backdrop before I get into exactly what this is, was we at some point encountered another firm in Texas in a completely different industry. And we got into a chat at an event like this, and we were talking the same language. And it's always just wonderful when someone else sort of invents something similar to you, completely independently, and you sort of meet them, and when you've been evangelizing something and someone else came to the same conclusion, the validation that you feel in that moment is almost religious. In any case, so what the purpose of this was we were looking for a different way to engage with the supply base. And what we were trying to do was extract a series of fairly complex trade-offs without asking your supplier, hey, how do you make money, right? A lot of traditional sourcing is, hey, pick your really big company, I'm going to come down and beat on you, you're going to show me your books, you're going to tell me what your margin is, I'm going to tell you that that margin's too much, I'm going to tell you that your margin might be different, and by the way, I'm going to help you save money by you doing this, and you're going to give me a better price. Well, we being smart people, decided that something other than brute force might possibly work. And what we wanted to do was extract information from suppliers without beating it from them. And so here's what we wanted to do. We created a number of levers, as it were. This notion of a firm commitment. I'm guaranteeing you a certain amount of business come hell or high water. There are normal orders. Hey, you have a lead time, you have a cycle time, I'm going to let you live at that cycle time. Then I have expedite options, which says, inevitably my forecast stinks, I need an emergency, hot lot to make it through your fab or your factory, whatever else. Tell me how much of that I can commit to. And by the way, like any other contract, it's going to break at some point in time, and how do I get out of this and at what cost? And the reason why we were very explicit about these items was we wanted our suppliers to be able to take actionable decisions against it. So if I go stage inventory, I have it as a supplier, I know, hey, you have this firm commitment, which means you're going to consume it sooner or later, or you're going to consume 80% of it, or 60% of it, and I can go price that. So if I'm going to sit on this for a year, I know how to price it. If I'm going to have to eat 20% of it, I know how to price it, right? And similarly, when the expedite option, now I have a clean record. You drop surprise orders with inside the lead time all the time. And I have this nebulous scorecarding process, and you either pat me on the back or hit me upside the head, depending on how well I've done. Well, now I know exactly what you're expecting of me, and I know how many assets I need to position in order to enable it. And by the way, if you don't use it, I go back to the firm commitment, and I know how long I'll be sitting on it again, right? So we're just trying to get ahead of a bunch of these questions. And of course, the buyout option was this notion of, again, either I'm the supplier and I promised you that hot lot, I got another customer who's willing to pay twice as much, I'm just going to figure out my way out of this, or something like that. But the terms of trade were very clear. The other thing that got out, of course, you sort of asked this, and then the question is, well, what does the supplier want? And it's remarkably interesting how varied the different suppliers' responses were. But what we gave them is, we would start the process with 4 or 5, a menu of contracts, as it were. Hey, you can engage with us in any one of these 4 ways, or you can come back and propose another way. And what I want you to do is price this. And once we got into this pricing business, we were amazed. We could go in the back and figure out what their fixed cost structure was, what their variable cost structure was, what their true cycle times were, the amount of information we could extract, presuming some level of rational behavior, which from the first exercise is never easy. But we were remarkably successful, and we did this in 3 or 4 industries, and it was amazing how consistently we would run into these problems where we could say, well, I don't think they can do more than 100,000 in that factory, because look at how they're responding to this. And then we would go and push them a little bit further, and the forecast was only for 90, but everybody in the group wanted to be in a factory that could go all the way up to 120, and it was clear that that factory was never going to hit it when you looked at the sort of complex set of responses. So this thing accomplished a lot of things, but what it really did in an interesting way, and it sort of ties back, was it created a framework to communicate to the suppliers from which we could extract a lot of information from them and start down this process of the whys again. What was fascinating, we had customers walk in and say, all right, which one has the highest price? I don't care what it is, I want the highest price, and I'll do whatever, any one of these you want, tell me the highest price. And we had others who will say, look, lock and load for the quarter, I don't want it to change, I don't want it to budge, I don't want to move, and I'm willing to pay for that. Like that first exercise, boy, did we miss on predicting who would like what. And in its own right, it was just a whole new, rich, fascinating dialogue with the suppliers that brought a lot more information to the surface from a framework, not even from, there was some math behind it that we eventually evaluated all these things in terms of selection, but it was very much this, again, a framework that extracted information from very senior people. There was one, we used one of these to replace an existing contract that I found quite fascinating, because if you looked at, and this is a great example of this sort of now what's rational behavior and not. People write in contracts and they'll specify limits on what you can do in the contract. And if you brutally mathematically analyze that contract, we had one situation where at about 7 months into the project, we were either going to max them out to their full capacity or shut them down. But we couldn't decide which until about 60 days beforehand, which was our contractually granted right. So we went to the client and said, well, you realize we can do this? He said, absolutely not. I said, well, no, this is how this is. Like, oh gosh, because we were in the midst of renegotiation. This was when 2001, when things were going south. We went back to the buyer and said, by the way, that price discount you negotiated, chances are you're not going to hit the volume requirement, and you're going to have to write a $5 million check in rebates, unless we get in this growth. Well, we would never do that. What do you mean you'd never do it? You're contractually obligated to it. Well, that's kind of mean. Well, you have it in the contract. I understand it's kind of mean, but you spent all this time negotiating this contract, right? And so it's kind of like the notion of the person offering up more than $50. Do you want to ruthlessly exercise this, or do you want to sort of, is this a repeated game, is this a one-time thing, etc.? Because of the information we extracted, it was interesting how this escalated through the organizations and what series of negotiations happened. The sad thing is, there was 5 great examples where eventually nobody could deal with the ramifications of admitting that such a big mistake was made, that they buried it into the purchase price of the next contract, so that no one ever saw the damage. And so, fascinating with that. Okay. What time do I have till? Till 10. All right. So, all of this for us is sort of translated into some semblance of an approach. Trying to fit on one slide, is this the all-encompassing approach? No, but I think it's very useful, and for me, this is certainly in the body of work that we do that is very much focused on the whys. So this first one is, it's all about the problem formulation, and I think it's hugely valuable to articulate the business problem qualitatively. And it's more than just qualitative, that's also sort of code word for just do it in English. Let's sit down and have a very specific conversation in English about what we're trying to do. And what you really want to get through is a conversation about what's important and what are everybody's different objective functions. Again, I'm already notionally heading down to a track where I'm not going to be able to give you exactly what the what is more often than not. And I'm on this path of, I think you're going to care a lot about the why, so I need to start assimilating all that information about the why. There's another great exercise that I encourage you to do inside your organizations, particularly with your sales and marketing organization, but also with the operations. It's called the Almanac Test. And it was first created by this very famous psychologist, I believe, or economist, Kenneth Arrow. So look it up. I highly recommend it. And what it does is it asks a list of 20 or so inane questions, things you would never know the answer to, like, what is the mass of Neptune? Or, what's the tonnage of the USS Missouri? And what it has you do is write down an answer, but more importantly, it asks you to write, give me your 10th percentile guess and your 90th percentile guess. So it's asking people to sort of bracket, their level of confidence around that response. And what you find is, and the pet name for the exercise is you don't know what you don't know. People choose remarkably narrow ranges. And way too many of the answers fall outside of the 10th and 90th percentile. They're really choosing something like the 35 and 65 at best. I mean, some of them are even beyond that. And again, it's just, the value of the exercise is a great way to sort of unlock, as you go into this, articulate the business problem, is just to sort of free people up. Hey, you really think you know what you do, and here's some inane things, and you vastly overestimated it. Now let me show you your forecast performance, or let me show you, where you thought you were 3 years ago, and it's not much different. So let's go into this exercise recognizing that there's a lot more open questions out there than we'd otherwise think. So I think it's a great exercise, and unfortunately, whenever you do the exercise, all the sales and marketing guys and even the ops guys all laugh, and they're like, yeah, in fact, that is no better than our forecast. Obviously then here is this metrics. We start caring a lot about the metrics. Inevitably, as you go through these and you start touching multiple organizations, not everyone's measured the same way. And so this is another great exercise in that objective function process, which is literally some people are measured, in inventory. There's often, the classic triangle. There's inventory, there's service level, and there's cost. Or some triangle, or speed, or whatever that third element is. And amazingly, people are measured on 2 out of the 3 very often, right? So they sort of don't care so much about the third. They have some good organizational intent, so they're not going to flush the metric. But when push comes to shove, they're going to get their bonus. You know what they're going after and what they're not. So it ends up being very interesting to sort of be very explicit about these trade-offs. But what you also understand is that, even take service level, which we all feel like we have a good understanding of. We had one client that was a big supplier to Intel. And we'd go through the service level exercise, and nobody could wrap their head around what the difference between 98 and 97 and 96 and 95% service levels meant. It wasn't anything that meant anything to anybody. But one guy finally said, look, if I can ship Intel everything they need, I can probably take the hit on everybody else. So if you're telling me I can get Intel what they need, and that's at 95 and I'm pretty good everywhere else, argument is done, right? So that's the non-natural, certainly not linear, objective function, but something that everybody in the room could universally agree to. And so now I got to go figure out how I'm going to roll that one into my model, right? Which is, did Intel get everything it wanted? Interesting, different, but absolutely important, and sort of gets back into the why. Again, nobody could understand what a service level was until you sort of translated it into very specific customer behavior. This is one of the biggest ones. Understand how the math will support the decision-making process, right? So that was very explicit, in this, which is math will support the decision-making process. I think where a lot of failure modes are in a lot of software solutions is the presumption is the math is making the decision. And it gives you the decision, but doesn't give you the opportunity to interact with it. From the outset, if you take your point of view is the math will support the decision-making process, trust me, it's no less valuable. Don't feel like you've marginalized the contribution of what you've just created. In fact, if anything, you have elevated the contribution of what you're doing. If nothing else, I have this long aspiration for the field. I'm on part of the roundtable, and we're talking a lot about what the progression of informs is in the analytics and how we get more of our members into more and more fascinating careers. This is where we start earning that table higher and higher in the organization, right? If I can mail in my answer, I don't ever get the seat at the table. If I can walk them through the process and become a facilitator of a high-quality, closed-loop, data-driven, objective process, I now start to get a seat at the table. If I'm not saying, if my answer to everything isn't, well, the model says, but rather, hey, here are the kind of trade-offs I hear you making, here are the levers we pull, and here's why this is important to you, you get viewed as a business person who happens to be really good with math and data, rather than the model person who's curmudgeonly and can't sort of live outside the math. There's at least one of you in here, I promise. And then the last thing in this is formulate the math problem. This is kind of the equivalent of a requirements documentation to the extent that you can walk people through. I often find it helpful to write the math on one side and the English on the other side, and find enough people to walk it through so that, yep, we're all talking about the same thing, we're all talking about the same thing. Communicate, make it as transparent as possible. Transparency is the antithesis of the black box, right? Not only starts, it starts at the very beginning of the process. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, all right. So here's the, my piece, and I sort of beat this one to death. Choose a solution, so fit, what will actually solve the problem. There's a lot of hammers out there looking for a lot of nails. Boy, it's amazing how often we still find ourselves whacking screws with hammers. is it strategic? And so this is another cut on my what are why problems versus what problems, right? Strategic, I often want more simplified inputs. I'm going to be in the scenario business. I sat through some of the networking lunches, I sat through a lot of the conversations, and everyone says, oh yeah, I spent a little time modeling and a lot of time collecting data. I think the other thing that really happens, at least in my experience, is I spend a lot of time running scenarios. What about this? What about this? What about this? And at some point, unless you can stitch together the whys through that, it just becomes a lot of scenarios. And at the end of it, there's nothing worse than 25 scenarios, maybe 13 different answers, and it felt like a good idea when I went through number 5, 6, 7, I'm feeling a little better, and then I started wandering off, and then the decision maker said, all right, now I got a new big data problem. I got more outputs than I know what to do with. Help me make sense of it. What's the make sense of it? It's the why, right? So, again, this simplified input, lots of scenarios, the why is more important than the what. Particularly if you're looking at anything a year out, 2 years out, price of gas, price of minerals, price of commodities, what Apple's going to come out with next. Did someone die in a factory? Who knows? That one got recorded. I wish that one didn't. All right, tactical. On the other side, the tactical. Hey, there's a great business. You need the live data. Again, what am I looking for? My personal passion and interest. Hopefully, at this point, it's abundantly obvious. I'm in the more strategic. I'm in the why problems. But there are a lot of tactical problems, and some of the why solutions are terrible at it. And I started a software company about 10 years ago. And if, in a nutshell, I blew it on these two. I never got the right mix between the strategic and the tactical and what kind of interaction, what the experience was. And that was probably, it was a fantastic life lesson for me in terms of doing it. Trying to do it the wrong way for 5 years and trying really hard to do it the wrong way for 5 years was a fantastic lesson. You learn a lot from your mistakes, and I'm eternally grateful for that. Most of my customers weren't, but frame the decision, right? So this is now where it's sort of the why comes back to where you want to be. Compare the optimal solutions versus the most robust solutions. This is one that's sort of near and dear to my heart. I started getting into this whole scenario thing, and it comes back to the why versus the what. This is another spin on it. I have a big machine, I hit run, it runs, it gives me an answer. I change an assumption, I hit run, I get a different answer. Now I got a problem. But what I would love to have known is, hey, how did the second best solution do in both of those scenarios? Maybe the same solution is always number 2. Wouldn't I love to know about that? And I'd like to know why. As you think about this, and as you sort of weave back through this, how do I start factoring this other factor of what's a robust solution? How often does it appear in the ranking, and why is it consistently showing up? There's a lot to be learned, and that may be the better what than whoever's winning each of the specific scenarios. So this is just another piece where you've expanded the objective function. I care more about what's the best answer in every given situation, and a little bit about how is this recommendation going to stand up over time. So I think for me that's a great example of some of the whys. Communicate the whys. Everyone laments how much PowerPoint work you often do in this business. But if you can be concise about it, you can be focused about it, and you can really focus on the whys and not the whole story about how beautiful your model is, you actually can get a lot of value out of those, hopefully a small number of PowerPoint slides. And then here's my favorite one. This is another variation going back to how I get my seat at the table, which is communicate and facilitate the trade-off between multiple objectives. Right now, instead of being the person who sort of built a model, put it in, and is clinging to it dearly for life, you've become the person who understands different conflicting objectives across the organization. You've brokered information and relationships. You've used this as your platform for creating a point of view and facilitating it through the organization. You're engaging with the senior decision makers and communicating to them and helping them through the complex set of trade-offs that they're trying to make. It's interesting. A lot of these decisions are big bets, and they want to be comfortable with their big bet. A large part of what we're doing is trying to make them comfortable with their big bets. And I think there's a huge value in being able to do that and doing it credibly. I think it's a great thing for individual careers. Those are when you see a lot of the analytics individuals and their careers really take off. It's when they become, this is what makes you a trusted advisor. right? Up until this point, you're someone running numbers and you're an analyst. You're now sitting at the table doing this, and you're a trusted advisor. And I think that makes a huge difference, whether you're an internal resource or, in my case, an external resource. This is one interesting example. It's now quite old. It's from an electronics company that, back, I don't know how many years ago, was trying to figure out how to get a bunch of stuff deployed in Europe. And one of my least favorite things to do is try and put a dollar value on turnaround time, right? Which is what this TAT stands for, and this is measured in days. So how many days does a customer have to wait for a product? What's 1 day worth? I don't want to put a dollar value on it. If you can do it well, call me. I can make a lot of money if you can tell me how to do it. On the other side, there's the return on invested capital. No finance person would actually recognize this as a great calculation of return on invested capital, but it was a metric that we could all agree on. It was a poor man's proxy for it. We gave it this label, and it was, once everybody understood what it was, everyone was comfortable with the decision. And then what we did is, we ran lots and lots of scenarios, but there were some pet ones that everyone wanted to look at, and that's what all these things, so building hubs, doing this thing. And ultimately what this came down to was a complex, or not so complex, but a trade-off between getting tax breaks in different countries and economies of scale, and proximity to markets. And so what happens is, at some point, we got to win just from where we were to where we wanted to go, because we got more tax breaks and we got to the market faster, right? The ultimate place to be on this graph is somewhere up here, right? Massive return on invested capital and the fastest possible delivery. And so anything moving in this direction is a positive item, right? So the first step came for free. Hey, I'm getting more tax breaks, I'm in more markets, this is a great thing. And now then I got into the world of having to make some trade-offs. As I opened up another distribution center, yes, I'm closer, but now I'm getting decreasing return. My centers are too small, the operating costs are getting too high, and as I go further and further down this path, increasingly I'm faster and closer to the market, but the economics are getting worse and worse. I know, for me, the value, as the analyst, I'm not equipped to make that decision. I don't know what trade-off marketing wants to make. They can't tell me what a day is worth. But the business could look at this and say, all right, I think this is what we need to do, this is where to be, maybe it's a progression. But we're obviously going to take the free one. Maybe we'll go to 6D, and if we really feel like the turnaround time is helping us win market share, we'll continue to evaluate going further, but at least now we know what's out there. So, again, the point is, didn't make a decision, don't know what the what is, have no idea how the different people in the room are going to make trade-offs between these elements, and not at a high enough pay grade to even be making that decision, perhaps. But put in front with some good slides behind it, explaining what the key inputs were, and getting the buy off the model, people could understand the whys, they could interact with the decision, and they could exercise their judgment, right? And of course, you do your sensitivity analysis and all the other good stuff that we do. But sort of going to that punchline, we enable people to engage and interact with the math. And I think that's one of just the key things, and being able to answer the whys along the way.